Alright, so in this video we're going to start by creating a simple counter application which will consist of a label and also a button. Whenever we press a button, the counter value is going to go from 0 to 1 to 2 and so on. Right now you can see that I'm inside the app component, and I'm going to implement all the counter stuff inside the app component, and later on we can see that how we can extract the counter into a separate component. But right now we're just going to start with the app component. So right now it's displaying h1 with the value app. I'm just going to say 0. So the counter is 0. Okay. In order to increment the counter, I will add a button, and that button will say increment. Now if I go ahead and click on the button, nothing really happens. You can see it's not really incrementing. So the first thing I need to do is I need to find out that how can I access the button click, the event, the on click. Right now the button is not really sending a message to a handler that can handle the button click. There's no on click over here. So let's go ahead and use on click. Now one thing you will note over here is that in plain old JavaScript you will use the on click with a small c, but this is not plain JavaScript. This is called JSX, and you have to use the on click with a capital C because this is all virtual DOM. Equals to, and then some sort of a function that we will define over here. So I'm just going to call it handle increment click or pressed. Since we are inside a class, I will have to call it this.handle increment click, where handle increment click is a function. So this is just a reference to the function. We're not really actually calling the function at this point. I still have to implement this particular function. So I can say handle increment. There we go. And inside this, just to see that if the function is actually getting fired or not, I'm going to go ahead and console.log it out so that I can see that when I press the increment button, the function is actually getting called. Let's go ahead and press the increment, and now you can see right over here that it's saying handle increment is getting called. So this is great. This means that the event is hooked up correctly and we are calling handle increment. So even though the handle increment click is getting called, this number over here, the actual counter value, is not being incremented. So the first question would be, well, we have to change this 0, and we have to provide some sort of a variable that we can increment every time the person clicks on the button. But what kind of a variable should we use? Should we create a variable over here? Let's say let value or counter equals to 0, and then counter plus equals to 1. Well, that's not going to work out, because this means every time you click on the button, this line is going to get executed, which means it is just going to reset the counter to 0 value. So that's not going to work. Okay, so let's not do that. Well, maybe we can go ahead and create some sort of a property. I mean, we are inside a class. This is a class, and class can have different properties and attributes. So maybe we can just create a property. So in order to create a property, I'm just going to create a constructor. And in the constructor, I can maybe say this. Let's go ahead and first save it. All right. Now, whenever you create a constructor, make sure that you are calling the super constructor. The super in this case meaning the parent class of the current class, which is parent of app, which means it is the component. If you don't call super, then obviously you'll get some issues. Okay, so we have a constructor. It calls super, which is basically calling the constructor of component. And then we can go ahead and create a variable, which is a property, and we can initialize it with 0. This means that we have created a property called counter, and this property will be available for every instance, every object of the app class. This means that I can use this.counter anywhere. Okay, so this means that I can go ahead and do this.counter plus plus, which is same as equals plus equals to 1. Both are exactly same. And let's go ahead and print out this value. So console.log this.counter. Keeping in mind that this.counter is a property on the app class. So I'm going to go ahead and press increment, and we are getting some weird issues. It's saying cannot read property counter of undefined. Counter of undefined. Of undefined. That's a very important wording. Of undefined. Of undefined. What does that mean, of undefined? Of undefined means that this is undefined. If you go ahead and print out console.log this, and if I simply just go ahead and comment out the rest of the code, you will find out that when I press on increment, it's coming out to be undefined. In other words, this does not have any value, or it is undefined when we are using it inside a function of a class. And that's just the normal behavior of how this is used inside a function of a class. It's always undefined. This is kind of interesting because what about if we do it over here? We are already doing it over here. You can see that we said this.counter and it didn't really error out. I mean, it worked perfectly fine. So if I go ahead in the constructor, and I'll just actually write it down, that we are inside a constructor. And if I try to print the value of this over here, do you think that will be undefined also? So let's go ahead and save it. Well, it's not. You can see that it is actually giving out some values, which means that this is not undefined inside the constructor, but this becomes undefined when we are accessing it inside a class function. So now the question is, well, how do we fix this? So let's go to the next video and check out something called binding in JavaScript.